First contact in the medical classroom. Dr. Elias Harper stood at the head of the sterile, fluorescent-lit classroom, his steel-gray eyes sweeping over the sea of faces before him. Every chair in the lecture hall was filled, the occupants a mix of eager first-year medical students and those whose exhaustion was already palpable. The faint scent of antiseptic lingered in the air, mingling with the tension that often accompanied the start of a new term. Medicine is a science, Harper began, his voice steady and resonant. But it is also an art. One requires precision, the other humanity. Mastering both will determine whether you save lives or destroy them. His words hung in the air, casting a spell of silence over the room. In the third row, Maya Anwar adjusted her glasses, her dark eyes narrowing as she scribbled the quote verbatim in her notebook. To her right, Kevin Daniels sat slouched, the corners of his lips twitching with a smirk. "Quite the dramatist, isn't he?" Kevin muttered, just loud enough for Maya to hear. She shot him a sidelong glance, but said nothing. Kevin had a reputation for being glib, a defense mechanism, she assumed, against the crushing expectations his wealthy surgeon parents had placed on him. Maya had no such luxury. Her parents had sacrificed too much to send her here, and failure wasn't an option. Harper continued, pacing the front of the room like a predator sizing up his prey. "Medicine will test you. Not just your intellect, but your character. Some of you will falter." He stopped abruptly, his gaze locking on a student in the back row. "And some of you will fail." In the farthest corner of the room, Alex Varga leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. His sharp features were illuminated by the glow of his tablet, which he used to scroll through Harper's biography rather than the lecture slides. Maya noticed him, her curiosity piqued. Alex was a wild card, rumored to have transferred from another prestigious program under mysterious circumstances. He seemed uninterested in proving himself to anyone, a stark contrast to Maya's relentless determination. Harper turned to the whiteboard and scrawled Case Study 1, Differential Diagnosis, in bold letters. "Let's see if you can think like doctors," he said, stepping aside to reveal a series of symptoms written below. Patient, 47-year-old male. Complains of chest pain, shortness of breath, and fatigue. Test results: elevated troponin levels, slightly irregular ECG, and borderline anemia. "What's your diagnosis?" Hands shot up across the room. Harper ignored them, scanning the students until his gaze landed on Maya. "Ms. Anwar," he said. Maya's heart raced, but she squared her shoulders. The symptoms in elevated troponin suggest a possible myocardial infarction, but the borderline anemia could indicate something systemic, like chronic illness or nutritional deficiency. "I'd recommend further testing to rule out." "Too slow," Harper interrupted, his tone razor-sharp. "In an emergency, hesitation kills." Maya flushed, her grip tightening on her pen. Before she could retort, Alex's voice cut through the tension. "Pulmonary embolism," he said, without raising his hand. All eyes turned toward him. Harper arched an eyebrow. "Bold assumption, Mr. Varga. What leads you to that conclusion?" "Chest pain and shortness of breath point to cardiac or pulmonary causes," Alex said coolly. "The anemia could be a red herring or linked to a chronic condition. But the irregular ECG combined with those symptoms? Classic presentation of a PE." A flicker of amusement crossed Harper's face. "Interesting. Let's say you're correct. What's your next step?" "CT pulmonary angiography to confirm," Alex replied. "Good," Harper said, nodding. "But not perfect. Remember, you're treating a human, not a test result. Stabilize the patient first." The room buzzed with murmurs as Harper turned back to the board, but Maya remained silent, her mind racing. Alex's confidence irked her, but his logic was sound. As the lecture continued, Harper drilled the class with rapid-fire questions, probing their knowledge and pushing their limits. Maya answered several correctly, her earlier embarrassment fueling her resolve. Kevin chimed in occasionally, his humor thinly veiling a sharp intellect. Alex, however, remained the enigma, his insights cutting through the noise like a scalpel. When the session finally ended, the students filed out in hushed groups, their conversations filled with dissected diagnoses and whispered speculations about Harper's unrelenting methods. Maya lingered, her notebook clutched to her chest. She approached Harper as he packed up his materials. "Dr. Harper?" He looked up, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to say, I won't hesitate next time." For the first time, a faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "See that you don't," he said, before turning and walking away. As she exited the lecture hall, Maya spotted Alex leaning against the wall, scrolling through his tablet. He glanced up as she approached, his expression impassive. "You were close," he said. "So were you," she replied, her tone clipped. He smirked, pushing off the wall. "Guess we'll see who's closer next time." Maya watched him go, her jaw tightening. The classroom might have been sterile, but the battle lines were clearly drawn. This wasn't just about mastering medicine, it was about survival. And Maya Anwar had no intention of losing. Field study on Earth 1. Dr. Leora Valen adjusted the viewport of her portable scanner, her eyes narrowing at the holographic readout. She stood at the edge of a dense, humid forest teeming with Earth's peculiar sounds: chirping insects, rustling leaves, and the occasional distant cry of an animal. Despite its chaotic unpredictability, this was precisely why the Council had sent her. Earth was the last unmonitored Type 2 planet in the quadrant, and its anomalies had remained stubbornly outside the grasp of galactic comprehension for decades. Behind her, Reese Eakin, her assigned field technician, leaned against a tree, juggling a diagnostic orb in one hand. "Let me guess," he said, smirking. "You're still not finding the pattern?" "There is no pattern," Leora muttered, irritated. "The biological signatures keep shifting in ways that make no evolutionary sense." "Welcome to Earth," Reese said, tossing the orb in the air again. "The planet where logic goes to die." The Council should have sent a poet, not a scientist. Leora ignored him and crouched to examine the ground. Her scanner pinged softly as it locked onto a faint energy signature, a cluster of glowing spores nestled in the soil. She frowned. "These weren't here an hour ago." Reese straightened, his playful demeanor evaporating. "Spontaneous generation?" "Something like that," Leora said, cautiously reaching for a containment vial. The spores pulsed as though alive, their glow intensifying when her hand drew near. She hesitated, then carefully scooped them into the vial. Reese moved closer, his eyes fixed on the tiny lights. "They're reacting to you?" "That's impossible," Leora said, though the unease in her voice betrayed her certainty. She sealed the vial and placed it into her satchel. "Let's keep moving. The village is 2 kilometers west. I want to make contact before nightfall." The forest deepened as they walked, the towering trees blotting out the sun. The air grew cooler, and the sounds of life faded into an unsettling silence. Reese adjusted his wrist monitor, scanning the area. "Something's off," he said, his tone now serious. Leora glanced at him. "What do you mean?" "The biosignatures are thinning out. It's like the forest is retracting." As if on cue, the ground beneath their feet trembled. Leora stumbled, grabbing Reese's arm for balance. The trees around them seemed to sway unnaturally, their trunks elongating and twisting as if responding to an invisible force. "Run," Leora said, her voice sharp. They sprinted through the forest, dodging roots that seemed to rise deliberately in their path. The tremors grew stronger, and a low, guttural hum resonated through the air. Leora's scanner beeped frantically, displaying erratic readings. "This way," Reese shouted, veering left toward a break in the trees. They burst into a clearing and skidded to a halt. In the center of the clearing stood a figure. At first glance, it resembled a human, tall, with slender limbs and a face that might have been carved from pale stone. But its eyes glowed the same pulsating light as the spores Leora had collected, and its body seemed to ripple, as though it were only partially tethered to the physical world. Reese raised his diagnostic orb defensively. "Friendly, you think?" "Unlikely," Leora whispered, stepping forward cautiously. "Who are you?" The figure tilted its head, and its voice echoed in their minds rather than the air. "Why have you disturbed the cycles?" Leora's mouth went dry. "We're researchers. We mean no harm. You interfere." The figure's form flickered, its edges dissolving momentarily into a shimmering mist. The spores are not yours to take. Leora's hand instinctively went to her satchel. There's sample. For study. The figure stepped closer, its presence radiating an almost suffocating pressure. Your kind always studies, always takes. But this place is not yours. Leave, or be consumed by what you do not understand. Before Leora could respond, the figure dissolved entirely, and the forest erupted into chaos. The trees bent and groaned, their branches whipping through the air. The ground cracked open, revealing a network of glowing roots that pulsed like veins. "We need to go. Now!" Reese shouted, grabbing her arm. They ran again, the forest seeming to push back against them at every turn. Vines lashed out, narrowly missing their limbs, and the ground shifted beneath their feet. Leora clutched her satchel tightly, her mind racing. Finally, they broke through the treeline and stumbled onto a rocky outcrop overlooking a river. They collapsed, gasping for breath. Reese turned to Leora, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" Leora didn't answer immediately. She opened her satchel and pulled out the vial. The spores inside were glowing brighter than ever, their light pulsing in sync with her own rapid heartbeat. "I don't know," she said finally, her voice trembling. "But this planet, it's alive in ways we've never encountered. And it doesn't want us here." Reese stared at her, his expression unreadable. "So, what do we do?" Leora looked back at the forest, its twisted canopy casting long shadows over the land. "We finished the study," she said, her voice steady despite the fear coiling in her chest. "But we tread carefully, because if we're not careful, we might not make it off this planet alive." Above them, the sky darkened, and the first stars began to appear. The forest behind them seemed to settle, its unnatural movements subsiding into stillness. But the glow of the spores in Leora's hand told her the encounter was far from over. The Medical Final Revelation, Chapter 1. Dr. Eleanor Vance had always believed medicine was a battlefield, where every diagnosis was a skirmish and every cure a triumph. It was this belief that had driven her from the bustling trauma bays of Seattle to the unassuming corridors of St. Helena's Research Hospital. But as she stood in the cold glow of the hospital's fluorescent lights, staring at the encrypted email on her tablet, she realized she might have underestimated just how treacherous her field of war could be. The subject line read, "Revelation Protocol. Urgent." It wasn't the urgency that unnerved her. She was accustomed to crises, ruptured aneurysms, crashing patients, moments where seconds separated life and death. What made her pause was the sender, Dr. Nathaniel Cross. Eleanor's grip on the tablet tightened as memories surged to the surface. Cross had been her mentor, her rival, and for a brief, intoxicating moment, her partner in a whirlwind of innovation and ambition. That was before his unceremonious departure from St. Helena's 5 years ago, following allegations of unethical experimentation. He'd vanished without a trace, leaving behind whispers of hubris and the faint scent of scandal. Her finger hovered over the message. Curiosity warred with caution. "Dr. Vance?" Eleanor snapped out of her thoughts. She turned to see Dr. Ajay Mehra, her research partner, balancing a tray of coffee cups and a stack of patient files. His perpetually disheveled hair and rumpled lab coat suggested he hadn't slept in days, which was likely true. "Everything okay?" he asked, nodding toward the tablet. "Yes, just spam," she lied, locking the screen. "What's the update?" Ajay set the tray down on the cluttered desk they shared in the lab. "Preliminary results from the trial subjects. Group A is showing significant improvements in cellular regeneration rates, but there's a caveat." "Always is," Eleanor muttered, taking a coffee. "The anomaly we saw in the first batch? It's consistent. Subjects in Group A are exhibiting accelerated neural activity, particularly in regions associated with memory and cognitive function. That's not necessarily a bad thing." Ajay hesitated, his expression darkening. "It is as if it's happening at the expense of other systems. 2 subjects have shown early signs of organ failure. Whatever's triggering the regeneration is pulling resources from elsewhere in the body. It's like trying to run a high-performance engine on cheap fuel. It's not sustainable." Eleanor felt a pang of frustration. Months of meticulous research, and they were still miles from a breakthrough. "We'll recalibrate the formula," she said, though the confidence in her voice felt forced. Ajay studied her for a moment, then nodded. "I'll start running simulations. Try to get some rest, Ellie. You look like you're carrying the weight of the world." She managed a faint smile as he left, but his words lingered. Because he wasn't wrong. Once alone, Eleanor unlocked her tablet and opened Cross's email. The message was brief, but chilling. "Ellie, I know you've been working on Project Genesis. You're closer than you think. But there's something you don't know, something they haven't told you. Meet me at the old observatory at midnight. Come alone. This is bigger than both of us." Her heart raced. How did Cross know about Genesis? The project was classified at the highest level, known only to a handful of researchers at St. Helena's. If he had access to that information, it meant one of two things. He was lying, or he had a source inside the hospital. Both possibilities were dangerous. Against her better judgment, Eleanor found herself slipping into a black coat and grabbing her keys. She told herself she wasn't going for him. She was going for answers. The drive to the observatory was a winding, solitary journey through dense woods. The building itself was a relic, abandoned for years, its domed roof now a rusting skeleton against the night sky. Eleanor parked her car at the edge of the overgrown lot and stepped out, the cold biting through her coat. The door creaked open under her touch, revealing a cavernous interior lit by a single, flickering lantern. And there, standing in its feeble glow, was Nathaniel Cross. He looked older, thinner, and his once pristine appearance had given way to a shadowed face and unkempt hair. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, and brimming with unspoken knowledge, remained unchanged. "Ellie," he said, his voice a mix of relief and urgency. "Start talking, Cross," she replied, keeping her distance. "How do you know about Genesis?" He gestured toward a stack of folders on a nearby table. "Because I started it." Eleanor froze. "That's impossible. Genesis is my project." "Is it?" Cross interrupted, stepping closer. "Or is it what they gave you? A sanitized version of something much darker?" She glared at him. "If this is some attempt to discredit my work—" "Your work is brilliant," he said, his tone softening. "But it's built on a foundation of lies. Genesis isn't about curing disease or extending life. It's about control." "Control?" Cross nodded. "The neural enhancements you've observed, they're not a side effect. They're the primary objective. The people funding Genesis don't want to heal the sick. They want to create a population that's more compliant." Eleanor's stomach churned. "That's absurd. The data is what they've allowed you to see," Cross interrupted. "Do you really think you're the first scientist they've recruited for this? They've been running iterations of Genesis for years, Ellie. I was one of them. When I refused to push their agenda, they destroyed my career." She wanted to dismiss his claims, to label him paranoid or delusional. But the conviction in his voice, the haunted look in his eyes, it was too real to ignore. "What do you expect me to do?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Help me expose them," Cross said. "We can't do it alone, but together." A sudden noise cut him off. The sharp crack of footsteps echoed through the observatory. Eleanor turned toward the sound, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Did you tell anyone you were coming?" Cross asked, his voice low. "No," she whispered. His expression darkened. "Then we're not alone." Before she could respond, the room was flooded with light. Figures in dark tactical gear swarmed the observatory, weapons raised. "Dr. Vance, step away from him," a voice commanded. Eleanor's mind raced. These weren't police. There were no badges, no insignias. Whoever they were here for Cross. "Ellie, you have to trust me," Cross said, grabbing her arm. "If they take me, everything dies with me. The truth dies with me." She hesitated, caught between the unknown and the unthinkable. Then, with a clarity born of desperation, she made her decision. "Run," she said. Together, they bolted toward the back of the observatory, the sound of boots and shouted orders chasing them into the night.